Okay, welcome APUSH students to chapter 28 here, Liberalism at High Tide. Basically going to be talking about a little bit of JFK to introduce it, and then really focusing on Lyndon B. Johnson's tenure as president, and of course the Vietnam War. Okay, um, of course we remember that JFK was introducing civil rights aspects before he was assassinated. And Lyndon B. Johnson's really going to use a lot of the sympathy that Americans had, the romanticism that Americans had towards Kennedy, to help push a lot of that through. Now, his platform, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, his platform was based off of something he called the Great Society. You know, his kind of idealistic dream of what America should be. It focused on domestic programs, so home programs, including, of course, civil rights, a war on poverty, and he wants to increase education. Lyndon B. Johnson grew up basically a hillbilly, kind of poor. He was a teacher for a time, so he kind of never forgot his roots there, and that was things that he was very passionate about. He built on ideas and programs laid forth from the New Deal. He's going to get more legislation passed than any other president since FDR. So it's going to be a lot going on there. And again, he's going to build on JFK's promise. Kennedy had proposed health insurance for the elderly, anti-poverty and tax cuts in the Civil Rights Bill, like I said. And JFK helped demonstrate the power of image. I mean, JFK was a new type of politician. One based not as much on platforms as on personal charisma and charm. Now, LBJ was not a charmer like JFK was. He was an old school politician, and he got a lot of his stuff done in the back rooms. He was a very good politician, very good at the game. A big man, 6'4", had some size to him, and from Texas, so he kind of had a physicality to him. They called it the Johnson treatment. He liked to get right up in your grill when he was talking to you and stuff, and kind of make you feel uncomfortable. But that was his method. All right. Now, he's looking for, in the Great Society, healthcare for the poor and the elderly, which increases. So he helps poor people. Now, part of his mistake is that he has this rhetoric of war on poverty. We're going to end poverty in America. And it's not really that realistic. And it's the type of war you can't win. And so people, other politicians and critics will use that against him. However, he did help life for poor Americans and certainly the elderly as well. During his tenure, the poverty rate for African Americans decreased. Poverty and segregation did, however, remain in many areas. We know that even after the Civil Rights Act, there's some natural segregation going on. There are states that are very slow to desegregate and that fight tooth and nail the entire way. But his Great Society is very liberal. It's looking for changes in America, and it's definitely moving towards civil rights and all that stuff. During this time period, as you can imagine, there's a rebirth of the women's movement. Seems like all these other outsider groups are getting attention, and the women feel that it is time for them to get their just due. You certainly have labor feminists, women who are looking for equal pay for equal work, things of that nature. Now we've talked about a lot of women's rights leaders since the beginning of the year. Your Susan B. Anthony's and Lucretia Mott's and Alice Paul's and Ida B. Wells. There's a good sized list of them. The new one, the face of the new feminism here in the 60s and 70s is Betty Friedan. You definitely need to know her. She writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. And she argued that many housewives in suburbs weren't happy and that they lived these unfulfilled lives. When you watch TV, when you watch Leave It to Beaver and you watch these sitcoms in the 1950s and early 60s, the mom, the wife was so happy to, stay at home and, make the kids lunch for school and just to be subordinate to the man, the breadwinner. Kind of catered to him, made sure he was taken care of. Basically, this was the image that TV put forth. She says that's a bunch of malarkey, basically, and that women feel forced into these roles, and it's not what they're looking for. Their lives are unfulfilled. that many of the women seek education and independence and freedom. Now, some of this happens in 1960 with the advent of the birth control pill, and that's going to lead to a decline. Remember, we've had the baby boom. We're deep in the middle of the baby boom, coming back from World War II, and people are having large numbers, large families. The birth control pill is going to give women freedom, basically, from being shackled to too many kids. If you're constantly having children, it's really hard to go to college, and it's really hard to go get a job because then you have to have daycare, and daycare becomes expensive. So it leads to a decline in birth rates and basically the end of the baby boom generation. Now, Betty Friedan is she's part of the National Organization for Women, now a powerful feminist group in this time period. Oh, I forgot to get that off there. Sorry. Now, Vietnam. Vietnam's going to win or begin. Sorry. There are issues going on in Vietnam. North Vietnam has communist influence there. South Vietnam doesn't really want to be communist. We, of course, fear the Red Menace. We don't want communism spread. We're worried about the domino effect. If North Vietnam conquers South Vietnam and makes it red, then who's next? You know, the Koreas, and then all of Southeast Asia, and then it just keeps moving. And so, you know, Kennedy doesn't put troops on the ground during his administration, but he does send Americans as advisors and trainers to help the South Vietnamese resist the North, which isn't really that effective. When Johnson becomes president after Kennedy's assassination, he basically says he's not going to lose China. Remember that Truman was attacked by his critics for losing China in 1949, that because China became communist. Even though America sent them money, it was somehow Truman's fault that he wasn't strong enough, didn't provide enough aid to help China. So Johnson, again, this Cold War, even though, you know, he's a Democrat, both of the parties have to be anti-communism. They have to be Cold Warriors. So you can't survive politically without that. And so Johnson says he's not going to allow South Vietnam to go the way that China went, meaning he's not going to allow them to become communist. Now, there's a big incident, and you have to know it, called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This happens in August of 1964. And basically, there's a report that a United States ship was attacked in international waters by the North Vietnamese. And as you can probably connect the dots, many of our wars have been on sort of trumped up reasons. You know, the USS Maine exploding, even though later on we find out that it was a polar plate accident. Polk sending troops down to the border of Mexico so that and instigating a fight so that he could have a reason to declare war on Mexico. This is sort of the same thing. There's torpedoes fired towards an American ship, but it's not hit. And even the captain who radios it in says he's not sure exactly what it was, but Johnson's going to use it as a premise for war. And Congress is going to give Johnson the right to do whatever he wants to do, basically saying if you want to fight, if you want to send troops there, then you can. And Johnson's going to. And, you know, basically Vietnam starts off with something called Operation Rolling Thunder. And that's just, you know, over 1 million tons of bombing. More bombs are dropped on Vietnam than both Europe and Asia during World War II, which is an incredible stat. Just amazing, really. And they just, you know, fly planes over and they just bomb them and bomb them and bomb them. But of course, the Vietnamese are retreating underground, and the bombs are only so effective. And this is the Vietnamese home. It isn't much to the outside world, but it's theirs, and they love it, and they're going to fight for it. So really, Rolling Thunder basically won some people to the communist cause. And, you know, they're going to seek help from China, and they're going to seek help from the Soviet Union, their communist brothers. And there's a lot of, you know, Vietnam, we've mentioned it in prior chapters. It's a war kind of unlike any other in American history. It's a very deeply unpopular war. It's a war that in the beginning, the administration is trying to tell people that we're winning. Clearly we're winning. However, you have reporters over there overseas going with troops and stuff. There are people reporters digging for the truth, and there becomes a credibility gap. Writers begin to expose that the realities of the war were much different than what the administration is basically trying to sell you on. This is very much a living room war. Parents are sitting down to eat their dinner, watching the news, and they're seeing the body bags. They're seeing the dead count. You didn't have this in World War II. You didn't have this in Korea, any of the other prior wars. TV's really changed America's opinion about war. It used to be something that was happening somewhere else. Well, this seems all too close for comfort, and a lot of people begin to protest the Vietnam War. You get the rise of the student movement, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. They were founded in Michigan by students that are looking for social change. The '60s are really an answer. This is a generation of kids who were born to the greatest generation, who was born into an era of conformity, and they're pushing back against that pressure, the pressure to equal their parents, the pressure to conform in a society. So the '60s are really a rebellious time period, the era of rock and roll and counterculture and hippies. They issued the Port Huron Statement, which criticized the gap between the rich and the poor, as well as the nation's consumer culture. Basically, how materialistic and shallow we are is their criticism of it. They don't like the fact that there is this enormous wealth gap between our rich and our poor. And they're going to basically call themselves the new left, a term you need to be familiar with. And that is to separate them from basically the old left, which had gotten titled, communist and socialist. Again, you're in the Cold War. You can't afford to be anything close to socialism. You can't afford to be anything close to communism. So they're liberal. They want change, but they have to make sure that people don't identify them with communism, because that's just not something you can survive, not in this time period. All right. You got another group, Young Americans for Freedom. As you can see, a lot of the discontent here is coming from the youth. They're the ones that are going to be going and fighting in Vietnam. It certainly plays a role in it. Again, there are also people pushing back against what their parents are trying to force on them, conformity and everything. The Sharon Statement. Yeah, you don't really know that one anyway. Counterculture. That's hippies. Hippies are inspired by folk music, and later on, the Beatlemania, the British invasion hits America, which paves the way for much harder, grittier British bands like the Rolling Stones, who have quite a few more political songs like Paint It Black and Sympathy for the Devil, which are great songs, a little harder edge. You get a lot of turbulence towards the end of the '60s. As you can see at the title here, Days of Rage, 1968 to 1972. I've often said that 1968 seems to be the most troubled year possibly in American history. We have a war going on abroad, and we have tragedy at home in 1968. One of these is the Tet Offensive, which you need to familiarize yourself with. What it is in the Vietnamese New Year, which is a major holiday for them. It's expected that all hostilities will end. Basically, you have a little mini truce while both sides celebrate the new year. Well, the communists say, "Nah, we're going to catch you by surprise," and they make this attack. And the attack really wasn't very successful, but it made the South look, unprepared, and it's going to help turn people against the war. They don't think that Vietnam is winnable. They may be right, at least by fighting by the rules of warfare that we were trying to fight by, minimizing civilian casualties and things like that. But because of TV presence, you're going to see, this leads to, them spitting on our troops when they get home and calling them baby killers and stuff. There were a few instances of American soldiers going too far. And that's the stuff that's going to get publicized, of course, on TV. And so it really turned some Americans against our soldiers. which you don't see very often in American history. We're usually pretty patriotic, but not in this war. But it is a very difficult war to try to win. 1968 is a terrible year um, for political assassinations. You get another new race. Well, does it about? Sorry, let me check these. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Doesn't say anything about the political assassinations. So 68, you're going to see the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. As you can imagine, that led to, I think there was riots in over 100 cities in America. He is very beloved, both by blacks and many whites as well. He was assassinated, I believe, in Memphis. And, Bobby Kennedy went down south and did a really good job of trying to calm African Americans down, offering what support he could. He himself will run for president in 1968, but sadly, he will follow in his brother's footsteps and he will be assassinated as well. This is really going to throw the Democrats into a really tough place because Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been getting criticized and criticized and criticized about Vietnam, and he was really a guy that wanted to be known for his domestic legacy with his, education, helping the elderly, and his war on poverty and things. Elected not to run for reelection. He was eligible to, and he said he wasn't coming back. So the Democrats lose their star. Bobby Kennedy's the new star, young, charismatic, much like his brother. And he's going to get assassinated. So it puts the Democrats in a rough spot. It's really going to help Richard Nixon, Republican, win the election. As you can see, Nixon's going to run against Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. George Wallace is Southern. He's a racist, basically. He's going to win these states that were not happy with desegregation. Remember, Arkansas dealt with the Little Rock Nine crisis, and Alabama has, they're fighting back against desegregation, of course. So are these other deep southern states. Segregationist platform there for George Wallace. Law and order is what he wants. He wants to end all the protests. The Americans are tired of watching protests on TV, kind of like we were these last couple of years. I think you saw a lot of apathy towards some of the movements going on in America. So he's advocating law and order, but he's running on a segregationist platform, and that's his way of keeping peace, basically. And I'm sorry, I forgot to take these pictures. Oh, can I take that off? Will it let me? Yeah, there we go. Okay, excellent. Okay. All right. Nationalist turn. The Chicago Moratorium Committee, Mexican Americans protested the Vietnamese War. They argued that the draft hurt the poor, and they're right. I mean, Vietnam is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The rich, the fortunate sons, as the band Creedence Clearwater Revival would write a song about, the rich have draft exemptions and the poor don't. And you're seeing a lot more minorities have to fight in this war because, of course, they are represented in poverty in higher numbers than whites are. So many Mexican Americans are being drafted and forced to go fight overseas. They're not happy with that, especially when they're searching for more rights here at home as well. Women's liberation. Feminists tended to be younger, educated, and associated with the civil rights and anti-war movements, which makes sense if you think about it. Working class women don't have as much time to think about these things. A lot of times your revolutions in America or your movements, begin in the middle class. Some radical women sought to gain feminist goals through politics. They're wanting legislation and laws passed. There's also sexual politics, which advocated that women must have control of their bodies in order to shape their destinies. That's going to move us into abortions and awareness for sexual assault and sexual harassment. These issues, of course, are enormously prevalent today. These are big issues. Sexual assault on women has gotten a lot of airtime the last couple years here. And of course, abortion is always there. Ever since 1972, Roe versus Wade legalizing abortion, that issue has never truly gone away, and it's a hot topic for sure. This is also the time of homosexuals trying to fight for their rights as well. Homosexuality is illegal in many states in America in this time period. In New York, obviously a more liberal city. Stonewall Inn was a very famous gay bar. Ended up getting raided by police, really for no good reason, and this led to homosexuals fighting back. 2-day riot. It's going to basically, it's kind of like the event in the gay movement of the 1960s. All right. You can see here civilian bodies in Vietnam, and images like that would make its way to American screens, and that's not how Americans view ourselves. We expect to conduct ourselves with honor for the most part, so this does not play well back home. All right, so we have a new president, same old war, new president, Richard Nixon. And part of his platform is that Nixon's going to run. He says we're going to get our guys out of there. We're going to get our troops out of Vietnam. So he wants to basically resolve Vietnam. He wants peace with honor. He wants out of Vietnam, but it's got to be a way that's satisfactory to the United States, that doesn't make us look poorly in the eyes of the world, especially in comparison to the Soviet Union. So he pushes a platform that you need to know called Vietnamization. All right. And what that is basically we're going to pull U.S. troops out of Vietnam. We're going to have the South Vietnamese fight for themselves. We're still going to give them assistance, but they need to win the war. It's the South Vietnamese that need to beat the North Vietnamese, and we're going to slowly withdraw troops. Then, shortly after, the United States began bombing supply lines and bases in neighboring country, Cambodia. Cambodia borders Vietnam to its west, and Ho Chi Minh, the capitalist leader, the communist leader of North Vietnam, would often use something they called them the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it would go into Cambodia, and it would dip around and then come back into South Vietnam. And this was making it very hard to defeat the North, the communists, and so he authorizes these strikes in Cambodia that kills quite a few people. It doesn't play well because that country's neutral, even though they really kind of know that Ho Chi Minh's using their land, of course. But it doesn't play well for people who already don't like the war, who already, it's very unpopular with them. This led to many protests on college campuses. The most notable, of course, was the Kent State massacre. You have students protest, and they send out, I guess they think it's going to get crazy, so they send out basically the National Guard, and it gets a little heated, and the National Guard fires on them, and they kill a couple of students. Maybe not a true massacre in the sense of the word, but certainly not something you've come to expect in America. All right, Richard Nixon, a little bit more about this man. He's going to be infamous. Richard Nixon and the politics of the silent majority. Now, Nixon has some successes, and one of those successes is détente. And you need to know détente. Détente is a lessening of Cold War tensions. You remember under Kennedy was probably the worst it was. Actually, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Johnson, of course, is fighting a war in Vietnam against communism. So that's kind of rough. Nixon comes in, and he's going to ease tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. He gets an important legislation passed called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. That's signed by Nixon and Khrushchev's successor, Brezhnev, who's the new leader of the Soviet Union. And then he does something no other American president had done. He takes a visit to China. Remember, we did not recognize China as China. Kai-shek and the nationalists had lost the Civil War, and they had fled to the island of Taiwan, just south of China. Well, Big China always considered Taiwan part of them. But we recognized Taiwan as the real China instead of the People's Republic of China, which the huge country that actually is China, we didn't recognize them. So that meant that we had bad relations with us in China. Well, Nixon's going to help fix that. He's going to take a visit to China. Very important. And of course, Nixon is going to get us out of Vietnam. So he does have some accomplishments. All right. Silent majority speaks out. Law and order in the Supreme Court. You get the Warren Court from 1954 to 1969. That's the court that's not gonna. They're gonna find that Kennedy's assassination was done solely by Lee Harvey Oswald. They are accused of legislating from the bench, and rights of the accused increased. Basically, they're pretty liberal. Is what's saying. You get 1966. You get an important law passed that you need to remember: Miranda versus Arizona. This is your right to remain silent. You've seen it in a million movies. It's a right to protect people from police brutality and corruption of the law. Whoops. Okay. This bench, the Warren Court, also sanctioned religious practices that sanctioned religious practices in public schools were prohibited. Remember, the 50s were pretty churchy. You had some infringements on separation of church and state, and so the court is going to come in and really smash those up. You get a busing issue in this time period because in the 1950s, thanks to Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, schools were ordered to desegregate. However, they had this silly wording called "with all deliberate speed," and the South is going to use that to keep from desegregating very quickly. It takes forever to desegregate because they're going to say, well, we're getting to it, but we can't do it overnight. We are doing it with all deliberate speed. Of course, that's very subjective. However, it does at least get the wheels rolling in the right direction. 72 election, Richard Nixon running against his main opponent is George McGovern. As you can see, it is a landslide. Many Southern whites switched to the Republican Party. So we got to switch. All right. And obviously today, the South, almost every time, presidential-wise, votes Republican. Nixon versus George McGovern, the Democrat out of North Dakota. He doesn't even win his own state. Nixon wins in this massive landslide. And we're not done with Nixon. We'll talk about Nixon in our next chapter. So major topics you got to remember: Great Society. That was just like the New Frontier was Kennedy's platform. The Great Society was Johnson's platform. It's advocating the war on poverty to help the elderly and better medical care. Immigration Act of 1965 didn't really talk much about it. Just another way that we limit immigration. As you can see, that happens quite a few times throughout American history. You definitely got to know Betty Friedan, and now she is the modern face of the women's rights movement. She writes Feminine Mystique. You need to know Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Congress allows, on some pretty shoddy evidence, allows Lyndon B. Johnson to essentially declare war on Vietnam. Probably something that he would have liked to have taken back. He basically got into something that didn't turn out very well for America. You have the rise of the counterculture in the 1960s, a pushback against conformity and the previous generation, the greatest generation, so-called greatest generation. The Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese attack on the holiday of Tet made us look unprepared, made us look like we were losing. People were already suspicious that we might be losing. And so the Tet Offensive is going to lead to a lot of protests. We got to get our troops out of there. In 1968, you had, again, that very turbulent year. You had the Tet Offensive. You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., of Robert Kennedy at the Democratic Convention. Title IX, didn't really talk about Title IX in the notes. But Title IX is very relevant today. That is a women's equality thing. That's, Title IX is, if there's a boy sport, there's got to be an equal girl sport to equal it out. Now, there are some loopholes, but it also means that if there are 500 scholarships for boys in college, there's got to be 500 scholarships for girls in college. So there's quite a bit with Title IX in today's world. Stonewall riots was part of the gay movement. It was in New York City, and it's going to kind of publicize uh, gay movements, that they're trying to fight for equality. Vietnamization down there at the bottom. That's a Nixon policy that the South Vietnamese have to fight their own fight. They're going to have to win their own war. We're going to pull troops out and let them handle their own business. I hate to tell you the ending, but they don't handle it very well. And the North Vietnamese are going to roll through South Vietnam, and communism is going to take over. They're going to unite North and South Vietnam into one country. That will be communist. All right, we'll come back and see you here in a little bit.